The Cerebrum, RAD 310, Sectional Anatomy, Bachelor of Science in Medical Imaging Program, Chris Gibbons, instructor. The cerebrum is by far the largest portion of the brain. It's responsible for the most purposeful functions such as movement, sense perception, translation, thought, judgment, emotion, problem solving, speech, and language recognition. And those are just a few. Obviously, studying the anatomy of the cerebrum is quite complex undertaking, perhaps the most difficult single piece of anatomy that you'll study in cross-sectional anatomy. In this media presentation, we will go over basic anatomy of the cerebrum. The brain is imaged for several reasons, including trauma, vascular abnormalities, and neoplasms. If any pathology occurs in the cerebrum, many of its functions may be affected. This screen image is an axial MRI through the midbrain. In the right temporal lobe of the cerebrum, there is a distinct round mass with surrounding edema. This mass was determined to be a high-grade glioma, with the edema suggestive of a glioblastoma multiforme. This is the most common and aggressive malignant primary tumor in the human brain. Upon completion of this section of the media module, you should be able to 1. Differentiate between gray and white matter. 2. Explain the divisions of the brain. 3. Discuss in detail basal nuclei. 4. Locate the following on sectional images: gray matter, white matter, longitudinal fissure, corpus callosum, and basal nuclei. The cerebrum is composed of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter consists of unmyelinated nerve fibers, nerve cell bodies, and supportive tissues. White matter is mainly myelinated nerve fibers. The outer 3 to 5 millimeter border of the cerebrum is termed the cortex. It's composed of gray matter. Gray matter receives the sensory impulses and then transmits instructions to the necessary body structures and systems to initiate and control movement. The interior of the cerebrum is composed of white matter. White matter fibers serve as an information highways for the impulses sent to and from the cortex. Gray matter and white matter can be easily distinguished on sectional images. This is a coronal T1 weighted MR image showing the appearance of gray and white matter of the brain. The cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter and demonstrates darker in T1 weighted images. White matter comprises the deeper tissues and appears lighter in this image. The appearance of gray and white matter are reversed in T2 weighted MR images. The most basic division of the cerebrum is into right and left hemispheres. The longitudinal fissure is the line by the durafold and the flax cerebri. These two structures provide the partition that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. Despite this distinction separation between the two hemispheres, there is a specialized arch of white matter that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, called the corpus callosum. This arch of specialized tissue enables communication between the two halves of the cerebrum and is the largest, densest white matter structure in the brain. The corpus callosum has 4 primary parts that are noted on sectional images, and they can include 1. The rostrum. It's the inferior portion of the anterior curve, illustrated here with the letter R. 2. The genu, or anterior curve, here labeled G. 3. The body. That's the upper arched portion, labeled B. 4. The splenium, the posterior portion, labeled S. This screen illustration shows a colored brain section at the longitudinal fissure to feature the medial surface of the brain and corpus callosum. The brain is composed of convoluted folds of brain tissue called gyri. The gyri are separated by shallow channels or suluci and deep furrows called fissures. The primary fissures are the longitudinal and lateral fissures, while the central sulcus provides the main horizontal division for the cerebrum. Each hemisphere of the cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes, and they're named according to the cranial bone that they are near. The frontal lobe is located at the front of the brain. It's anterior to the central sulcus and superior to the lateral fissure. The frontal lobe is associated with reasoning, motor skills, higher level cognition, and expressive language. The temporal lobe is located on the bottom section of the brain, below the lateral fissure. It processes auditory and olfactory stimuli. The parietal lobe is immediately posterior to the central sulcus and superior to the lateral fissure, located in the middle section of the brain. The parietal lobe is the center of temperature, touch, pressure, vibration, pain, and taste perception. The occipital lobe is the most posterior, and it's primarily responsible for visual perception. Another part of the cerebrum to be aware of is the insula. In each hemisphere of the brain is the insula or insular cortex, and is a portion of the cerebral cortex folded deep within the lateral sulcus. The insula are believed to be involved in consciousness and play a role in diverse functions linked to emotion and even regulating the body's homeostasis. The basal nuclei, or ganglia, are areas of gray matter located deep within the cerebrum. They function together to coordinate muscle action and movement, such as swinging arms while walking. The basal nuclei include the following. The caudate nucleus. This runs along the lateral ventricle and includes three portions: the head, body, and tail. The lentiform nucleus, shaped like a lens, located between the insula, caudate nucleus, and thalamus. It includes two divisions, the globulus pallidus and the putnam. The colostrum. This is a thin linear structure located between the insula and the lentiform nucleus. And not located in this particular image is the amygdala. This is a small almond-shaped nucleus, located anterior to the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, and functions as a part of the limbic system. Strips of white matter separate the basal nuclei, forming the corpus stratum, or striped body. These tracts of white matter are the internal capsule, separates the thalamus and caudate nucleus from the lentiform nucleus, the external capsule, separating the colostrum from the lentiform nucleus, and the extremi capsule, separates the colostrum from the cortex insula. This is a coronal T1 weighted MR image showing the appearance of gray and white matter of the brain. The cerebral cortex is comprised of gray matter and demonstrates the darker T1 weighted images. White matter comprises the deeper tissues and appears lighter in this particular image. The appearance of gray and white matter are reversed in T2 weighted MR images. This is a very superior axial section of the brain imaged by MR. Notice the bright white signal of the cerebral spinal fluid. Bright CSF outlines the convoluted gyri as well. In this image, the cortex, or the gray matter, is lighter than the white matter. The reason to study this image is to note the distinction between the two large cerebral hemispheres. The longitudinal fissure is evident running the length of the cerebrum, dividing it into right and left cerebral hemispheres. Recall that the flax cerebri lines the longitudinal fissure. This is an axial T2 weighted MR image that demonstrates the basal nuclei as lighter than the surrounding white matter. The head of the caudate is easiest to locate first since it lies adjacent to the anterior or frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. The internal capsule is the thin band of white matter that separates the caudate nucleus from the lentiform nucleus. The lentiform nucleus is lateral to the internal capsule and is the larger, lighter structure in that region. There are many other anatomy structures highlighted in this particular slide. You may want to pause the video for a moment and just work your way around the image, studying the other structures within this particular slice. This is a sagittal T2 weighted MR image. The white matter is darker than the gray matter in this particular image. Since the basal nuclei are made of gray matter, look for the lighter structures surrounded by dark white matter. In this image, the caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus are labeled. The head of the caudate nucleus is located just posterior to the small portion of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle visible. The body curves up and around slightly. The internal capsule is a thin stripe of white matter that separates the thalamus from the lentiform nucleus. Other labeled structures that you'll see here are the diencephalon and the limbic system, which we'll study in later modules. This is a T2 weighted coronal MR image. Again, the caudate nucleus is easy to see following the curve of the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles. The dark stripe lateral to the caudate nucleus is the internal capsule. The next portion is lighter and is the putnam portion of the lentiform nucleus. On the lateral side of the putnam is another stripe of white matter, the external capsule.